Alright, well, let's look at Standard 13, Substandard B. Identify Jane Addams and the Hull House and describe the role of women in reform movements. Alright, let's do that. Alright, in the urban areas, we talked around Chicago, Boston, New York, and all that come about because of urbanization, rapid urbanization. And the slums there are going to rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization, and then immigration coming in created these situations in the slums and the urban areas where there were uneducated and neglected children, single mothers who worked, unhealthy habits like hygiene, and there was some unemployed and unskilled people and really had no hope in some situations. And as the muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and eventually Ida Tarbell were rioting, there were a group of people setting up in these settlement houses in the settlement house movement. And in the settlement houses, they built these houses to this is Robert A. Wood's, I guess, Andover House or South End House in Boston. To attack problems of the slums, they set up these houses, and there were over 100, by 1900, there were over 100 settlement houses that existed in the United States, usually staffed by college-trained middle-class idealists, a lot by women, and they were built to improve the lives and the futures of these slum dwellers in these urban centers. In other words, immigrants in urban areas who were uneducated, unemployed, some were unskilled. Anyway, they were set up for this purpose. There were a few. Jane Addams and Ellen Starr started the Hull House out in Chicago in 1889. Robert Wood's the South End House in Boston in 1911. Lillian Wald's Henry's Settlement House in New York City in 1895 were a few. And around Chicago, the same place where Pullman was, the Chicago meatpacking industry, we see now the Hull House being created. And remember those ethnic ghettos around Chicago where those immigrants come in. We talked about that, from Southern and Eastern Europe. And it's these people here that Jane Addams' Hull House is intended to help. So her whole purpose in creating the Hull House was to help the inner city urban poor that were in poverty. That was the number one concern. And she's going to open up this Hull House, and it's going to teach immigrants how to read, write, and speak English. Have a night school for adults, kindergarten classes during the day for kids, and clubs for older children, a public kitchen. And here's a picture of the Hull House here, and it's in Chicago, Illinois. Let's take a look on Google Maps. Here's a Google map here. You can go there and look. Here's Chicago over here. We talked about this geography before on the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan here. We can zoom in to Chicago and go straight to where the Hull House is. There's Chicago. Okay. And here is the Hull House right here, the museum today. And look at this. Alright, museum here, University of Illinois is at Chicago behind it. But let's look at Hull House here. Let's get a little closer view of it. Here it is here. That's the Hull House. Let's see if I can get a little closer in front of it here. Alright, there's the streets. This is the Hull House here, Jane Addams' Hull House. Okay. Alright, and that's in Illinois, in Chicago, Illinois, on Lake Michigan. Right there. Alright. So the Hull House that was built there is going to offer for urban inner city poor people several things. She has a daycare center there for children, a nursery, and for kindergartners for younger children to learn to read and write their numbers, colors, etc. Lectures in home care and hygiene for women. They taught English and work skills. Had an employment bureau there, and music and art classes in a studio there, and a gymnasium to help these kids get in shape and stay healthy. A men's club, a financial planning and saving lectures to help them save their money and plan their future financially. These are what the Hull House offered. And here's the coffee house or coffee room where they would eat and drink coffee and tea or what have you inside the Hull House. And here's the nursery inside the Hull House. And here's a panorama here of children. And here's Jane Addams here speaking to these children, teaching them. Here's a picture of an art class going on in the Hull House. Another little area where they were being taught. Here's the little girl drawing, painting, doing artwork. And here's children in the gymnasium working out. Jane Addams' quote was, "America's future will be determined by the home and the school. The child becomes largely what he is taught. Hence, we must watch what we teach and how we live." Another quote was, "The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life." And through the efforts of Jane Addams, we see that the government will become more active. Jane Addams and other settlement house people pushed for housing laws, public playgrounds, juvenile courts, mothers' pensions, compensation laws, workers' compensation, and child labor laws. Those are some of the things they asked government to change its role to become more active in. And we're eventually going to lead to those things being passed and incorporated into government action. Okay. Let's see. The Children's Bureau in 1912. We spoke of Lillian Wald down here. She pushes for the creation of the Children's Bureau as a government bureau that was created, and it says here, to investigate and report to the Department of Commerce and Labor upon all matters pertaining to the welfare of children and child life among all classes of our people, and shall especially investigate the questions of infant mortality, the death rate of children, the birth rate, orphanage, juvenile courts, desertion, child abandonment, dangerous occupations, accidents and diseases of children, and employment, legislation affected children in several states and territories. Eventually it's going to lead into things like the Department of Family and Children's Services, DFACS, fair standard laws where children can't work. We're going to see that. Okay. Now, if you recall, in our standard it says identify Jane Addams and Hull House, which we have, and it says and describe the role of women in reform movements. So women have been very instrumental throughout history in reform movements. We saw the Daughters of Liberty and how they helped to make fabrics during the boycott, during the Revolutionary period when we boycotted British goods, how they sewed and weaved fabric for people in America. We saw that. Abigail Addams, when her husband, President John Addams, became president, she urged him to remember the ladies. Her quote was, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited powers into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." And that's Abigail Addams. And then in our study of abolition movement, we talked about Sarah and Angelina Grimke, whose parents owned slaves. They were involved in women's suffrage movement and in the abolitionist movement. And again, Elizabeth Cady Stanton in a women's suffrage movement. The Seneca Falls Convention that happened in 1848, where women pushed for themselves to organize for the right to vote. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe, who kind of intensified Northern opposition to slavery and abolition with her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sold more copies than the Bible. And during the Progressive Era, women are also going to have this reform mentality and push for reforms. They're going to be very involved. Dorothea Dix, known for her reform for the mentally ill that were being put in prison. She called for the creation of mental asylums rather than just sticking mentally ill patients into prisons, to have these mental asylums that could help rehabilitate these people. Mary Harris Jones, called Mother Jones, 1903, was upset about the lax enforcement of child labor laws in Pennsylvania mines and silk mills, and she organized a children's march and went from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to the home of President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, in New York City, and marched in there children in Washington, D.C. too, children that were missing arms and limbs for working in the mills. And her push is for child labor laws, which eventually did come as a result. And here's showing the children's crusade that was led by Mother Jones here. It says, we want to go to school. More school, less hospital. So these children are part of her movement. And then an African American civil rights advocate, female by the name of Ida B. Wells, and later on she married Ida B. Wells Barnett, was an early women's rights advocate, and she wrote a book called A Red Record, in which she gave statistical data of the lynchings of African Americans in the United States. That's the hangings, the beatings, flogging of African Americans. And she opposed lynching and called for legislation to end lynching of African Americans. And then there was Carrie Nation in 1881, and her movement in the women's Christian temperance movement to get men to stop drinking alcohol, and a push toward prohibition movement. And she carried a hatchet into these saloons and busted the liquor bottles up and the mirrors in the saloons. She was arrested several times and released, and her movement is going to be for prohibition, to get people to stop drinking alcohol, selling it, manufacturing it. And that was a women's Christian temperance movement. And then for women's suffrage was Carrie Chapman Catt, who pushes for and eventually champions in 1919 the proposal of a 19th Amendment to give women the right to vote. By 1920 it had been ratified, and women received the right to vote. And Alice Paul helped Carrie Chapman Catt, but she also in 1923, after the 19th Amendment was passed, pushed for another amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, giving women equal rights in the United States. Finally was proposed in 1972 when the Senate passed it, but only received 35 state ratifications. Only 35 states ratified it when 38 was needed, and it failed. The Equal Rights Amendment failed in the 70s. And here's some pictures during Woodrow Wilson's administrations, when Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul pushed through for the 19th Amendment, and eventually they get that. She was arrested as well, and there's a coin commemorating Alice Paul's suffragist reforms. Okay, I think we have met this standard. Identify Jane Addams and the Hull House and describe the role of women in reform movements. Ask questions in class. Watch this video again. Pause it if you have to. Good luck on the quiz, the test, and the EOCT. Alright, well, let's look at Standard 13, Substandard B. Identify Jane Addams and the Hull House and describe the role of women in reform movements. Alright, let's do that. Alright, in the urban areas, we talked around Chicago, Boston, New York, and all that come about because of urbanization, rapid urbanization, and the slums there, urban areas, who were uneducated, unemployed, some were unskilled. Anyway, they were set up for this purpose. There were a few. Jane Addams and Ellen Starr started the Hull House out in Chicago in 1889. Robert Woods, the South End House in Boston in 1911. Lillian Wald's Henry's Settlement House in New York City in 1890. Are going to rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization, and then immigration coming in created these situations in the slums and urban areas where there were uneducated and neglected children, single mothers who worked, unhealthy habits like hygiene, and there was some unemployed and unskilled people, and really had no hope in Boston. To attack problems of the slums, they set up these houses, and there were over 100, by 1900 there were over 100 settlement houses that existed in the United States, usually staffed by college-trained middle-class idealists, a lot by women, and they were built to improve the lives and the futures of these slum dwellers in these urban centers. In other words, immigrants and urban in some situations. And as the muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and eventually Ida Tarbell were rioting, there were a group of people setting up in these settlement houses in the settlement house movement. And in the settlement houses, they built these houses to this is Robert A. Wood's, I guess, Andover House or South End House.